Bring her to me. The words were quiet, calm, barely louder than the string quartet floating beneath the crystal chandeliers. Yet somehow they landed with the force of a thunderclap. Conversation stalled. Champagne glasses paused halfway to waiting lips. Heads turned. At the center of the Grand Crescent Ballroom, where New York's wealthiest donors gathered beneath 20-foot ceilings draped in gold light, Ethan Whitmore lowered his glass and kept his eyes fixed on someone across the room. No one questioned him. They never did. Ethan Whitmore was the billionaire founder of Whitmore Capital, a man whose decisions moved markets before breakfast and reshaped companies before dinner. When he spoke, people listened. When he pointed, people moved. Tonight, he was pointing at a waitress. "Sir?" the event manager asked carefully. Ethan never looked away from her. "The waitress near the west staircase. Bring her to me." A ripple spread through the ballroom like a stone dropped into still water. Investors exchanged glances. Board members whispered. A social media influencer discreetly lowered her phone and followed Ethan's line of sight. The waitress stood beside a silver tray of sparkling water, completely unaware that 300 pairs of eyes were suddenly drifting toward her. Naomi Carter had spent most of her life trying not to be noticed. At 26, she understood something many wealthy people never learned. Being invisible could be a form of protection. Invisible people avoided conflict. Invisible people finished their shifts. Invisible people paid rent on time. Tonight's charity gala was supposed to be simple. Serve drinks. Smile politely. Stay professional. Go home. The ballroom glittered with more money than Naomi would earn in several lifetimes. Diamond necklaces flashed beneath golden light. Tailored tuxedos moved through the crowd like uniforms of a private kingdom. Everywhere she looked, people seemed to belong to a world built behind doors she had never been invited to enter. And that was fine with her. She wasn't here to belong. She was here to work. She adjusted the tray in her hands and continued moving through the crowd, unaware that Ethan Whitmore was still watching. The billionaire's expression remained unreadable. Cold. Controlled. The same expression that had appeared on the cover of business magazines for more than a decade. Yet something in his eyes had changed. Something subtle. Something nobody in the room could name. "Do you know her?" one investor asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer. Across the ballroom, Naomi stopped beside a table of donors discussing tax strategies and real estate acquisitions. She offered water with the same calm professionalism she gave everyone. A polite smile. A simple nod. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that should have attracted the attention of the most powerful man in the building. Yet Ethan's gaze never left her. Because he wasn't looking at her face. He wasn't looking at her uniform. He wasn't even looking at the tray she carried. He was looking at the bracelet wrapped around her wrist. A simple silver bracelet. Worn. Old. Unremarkable to anyone else. But Ethan Whitmore felt his pulse stumble the moment he saw it. For a second, the noise of the ballroom faded into the distance. The music disappeared. The conversations dissolved. The years folded backward. And suddenly he was no longer standing inside a Manhattan ballroom surrounded by billionaires. He was standing somewhere else entirely. Somewhere he had spent 20 years trying to forget. Ethan tightened his jaw. Impossible. The bracelet caught the light again as Naomi turned toward another guest. His chest felt strangely heavy. The manager followed his gaze and frowned. "Should I ask her to come over now?" Ethan finally nodded. "Now." The manager immediately crossed the ballroom. Guests noticed. They always noticed movement around power. Whispers multiplied. Had she spilled something? Broken protocol? Offended a donor? Naomi looked surprised when the manager approached. He leaned closer and spoke softly. Her eyes widened. "Mr. Whitmore wants to see me?" she asked. The manager nodded. Around her, the room seemed to hold its breath. Naomi glanced toward the center of the ballroom, where Ethan Whitmore stood waiting beneath a waterfall of crystal light. She had never spoken to him before. She had only heard stories. Stories about impossible standards, ruthless negotiations, billion-dollar deals. Yet as she looked across the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening. Something larger than a simple conversation. Something hidden beneath the polished surface of the evening. Slowly, Naomi set down her tray. Then she began walking toward the most powerful man in the room, completely unaware that every step was carrying her toward a secret buried for more than 20 years. Naomi Carter had learned long ago that people noticed uniforms before they noticed faces. The black vest, the white shirt, the polished shoes. Those things told a story before she ever opened her mouth. To most guests at events like this, she was part of the furniture. Useful, necessary, forgettable. And most days, she preferred it that way. As she crossed the ballroom toward Ethan Whitmore, she could feel hundreds of eyes following her movement through the crowd. It was an unfamiliar feeling. Normally people looked through her, not at her. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above like frozen waterfalls of light. Waiters moved silently between tables. The quartet continued playing, but the music felt distant now, swallowed by curiosity spreading through the room. Naomi kept her posture straight. Her grandmother had taught her that years ago. Stand tall, even when life gives you reasons not to. Especially then. The lesson had carried her through more than most people knew. She thought briefly of the small apartment waiting for her across the East River. 600 square feet. Aging hardwood floors. A radiator that worked only when it felt like it. It was not glamorous, but it was hers. Every paycheck mattered. Every shift mattered. Her life was built on careful calculations and long hours. During the day, she worked at a community education center, helping students prepare for scholarship applications. In the evenings, she accepted catering assignments and event work whenever possible. The schedule was exhausting, but exhaustion was cheaper than debt. Naomi rarely complained. Complaining never paid bills. She preferred action. The same attitude had guided her through childhood. Growing up in Newark, New Jersey, she had watched her grandmother stretch every dollar with almost magical precision. There were nights when they shared simple meals and mornings when old coats became new winter jackets with a little creativity and determination. Yet somehow her grandmother never spoke about what they lacked. She spoke about dignity, about kindness, about carrying yourself with respect whether you walked into a corner store or a ballroom filled with billionaires. Naomi could still hear her voice. Character is what remains when everything else is taken away. The memory steadied her now. Because despite her calm appearance, she was nervous. Very nervous. She had no idea why Ethan Whitmore wanted to speak with her. The billionaire remained motionless near the center of the room, surrounded by executives, investors, and political donors. The closer she got, the more intimidating the scene became. Expensive watches flashed beneath the lights. Conversations softened as she approached. Some guests openly stared. Others whispered behind carefully practiced smiles. Naomi caught fragments of speculation floating through the air. Maybe she made a mistake. Maybe she spilled something. Maybe she interrupted someone important. She ignored them. Experience had taught her that assumptions usually revealed more about the speaker than the person being discussed. Across the room, a woman in a diamond necklace tilted her head. Another guest folded his arms and watched with obvious curiosity. Everyone seemed eager for an explanation. Naomi wished she had won herself. The manager walked a few steps ahead before finally stopping. Ethan Whitmore stood less than 10 feet away now. Up close, he looked exactly like the photographs in business magazines. Tall, composed, impeccably dressed. Yet something felt different. The stories described a man of relentless confidence. What Naomi saw instead was someone studying her with unusual concentration, as though trying to solve a puzzle no one else could see. For the first time since the manager approached her, she noticed that Ethan was not looking directly into her eyes. His attention kept drifting toward her wrist, toward the old silver bracelet she had worn nearly every day for as long as she could remember. The bracelet was simple, slightly worn around the edges. Nothing about it suggested importance. Her grandmother had given it to her years ago. Naomi had never questioned where it came from. It was simply part of her history, a small reminder of home. Yet Ethan Whitmore stared at it, as if it belonged in a museum. The silence stretched. Guests leaned closer. The air felt charged with expectation. Naomi stopped a few feet from him and folded her hands calmly in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she noticed something she never expected to see on the face of one of the most powerful men in America. Uncertainty. It flashed across his expression for only a second before disappearing behind the discipline of a lifetime. But it was there. And somehow that made the moment even stranger. Because whatever Ethan Whitmore had expected to find tonight, it was clear he had not expected to find it standing right in front of him. The silence lingered just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Naomi stood calmly beneath the glow of the chandeliers while Ethan Whitmore continued staring at the silver bracelet resting against her wrist. Around them, the gala seemed suspended in time. Conversations had faded into whispers. Investors who usually discussed billion-dollar acquisitions now watched a waitress and a billionaire standing only a few feet apart. Neither seemed willing to speak first. Finally, Ethan drew a slow breath. "Where did you get that bracelet?" His voice was steady, but something beneath it felt different, less certain. Naomi glanced down instinctively. "This?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. "Yes." Naomi looked at the worn silver band for a moment before answering. "My grandmother gave it to me when I was 12. A flicker crossed Ethan's face. Not recognition exactly. Something deeper. Something older. What was her name? The question surprised Naomi. Guests nearby exchanged curious glances. This was not the conversation anyone expected. She hesitated. Margaret Carter. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. The name seemed to strike something hidden beneath. Years of carefully controlled composure. Naomi noticed his jaw tighten slightly. For a man famous for controlling boardrooms, controlling headlines, and controlling outcomes, he suddenly looked like someone struggling to control a memory. Across the ballroom, speculation intensified. Nobody could understand why one of the richest men in America seemed so focused on a simple piece of jewelry. Naomi could not understand it either. "Did something happen?" she asked carefully. Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he looked beyond her, beyond the ballroom, beyond the glittering crowd. It was the look of someone staring through time itself. 22 years earlier, before the private jets and magazine covers, before the skyscraper offices overlooking Manhattan, Ethan Whitmore had been a frightened 17-year-old sitting in a hospital waiting room. Back then, the Whitmore name meant nothing. His father had owned a small trucking business. His mother worked double shifts as a nurse. Money was always tight. Every unexpected expense felt like a storm cloud gathering overhead. Then came the winter that nearly changed everything. Ethan remembered the snow, the freezing rain, the endless uncertainty. His father had been involved in a serious highway accident during a snowstorm outside Philadelphia. Roads were closed. Emergency crews struggled to reach stranded drivers. Hours passed without information. His mother sat silently beside him, terrified but refusing to show it. Then a state trooper finally arrived with news. Someone had found his father. Someone had stayed with him through the storm until help arrived. A stranger. A woman nobody could identify. Ethan remembered his father's words months later after recovering. "Some people save lives without ever realizing it." The phrase had remained with him for decades. The stranger had disappeared before anyone learned her name. No address. No phone number. Nothing. Only one detail remained. A silver bracelet his father remembered seeing on her wrist while she sat beside him during the worst night of his life. Ethan had heard the story countless times growing up. His father spoke about that woman the way some people speak about miracles, not because she performed one, because she stayed when leaving would have been easier. Over the years, Ethan searched occasionally. His father searched constantly. Neither ever found answers. Then his father passed away 6 years earlier. The mystery went with him, or so Ethan believed, until tonight. Until he looked across a crowded ballroom and saw that bracelet. The exact design. The same worn engraving near the clasp. The same distinctive pattern. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes to Naomi. She could see questions behind them. Questions far larger than either of them. Around them, the crowd remained silent, sensing something significant unfolding beneath the surface. Naomi shifted slightly. "Mr. Whitmore," she asked, "why are you looking at me like you already know me?" Ethan stared at her for a long moment before finally speaking. When he did, his voice carried none of the authority that usually commanded boardrooms. It carried something far more human. "Because," he said quietly, "I think your grandmother may be the reason my father lived long enough to see me become the man I am today." For a moment, nobody moved. The words seemed to hang beneath the chandeliers, suspended above the ballroom like a secret finally spoken aloud after decades of silence. Naomi stared at Ethan Whitmore, trying to understand what she had just heard. Around them, the room had become impossibly quiet. Even the quartet seemed distant now, drowned beneath curiosity and disbelief. "My grandmother?" Naomi asked softly. Ethan nodded. "I believe so." She looked down at the bracelet again. The silver band suddenly felt heavier than it had moments before. Growing up, she had heard fragments of stories from her grandmother. Small stories. Incomplete stories. The kind older people tell while washing dishes or folding laundry. Stories that seem ordinary until years later when you realize they were never ordinary at all. She never mentioned your family, Naomi said. Ethan gave a faint smile. That is because my family never knew who she was. The answer only deepened the mystery. Several guests had subtly drifted closer, pretending to admire decorations or study auction displays while listening. Human nature rarely changes. Give people a secret, and they will always move closer. Naomi folded her hands together. I do not understand. Ethan glanced toward a nearby table before gesturing toward an empty seating area near the ballroom's edge. Would you sit with me for a moment? The request sent another wave through the crowd. Some guests looked genuinely shocked. Others exchanged puzzled expressions. The most powerful donor at the gala was asking a waitress to sit beside him. Not serve him. Sit with him. Naomi noticed the reactions immediately. She had spent enough years navigating social spaces to recognize discomfort when she saw it. Yet Ethan seemed completely unaware of the attention. Or perhaps he simply did not care. They walked together toward the small seating area overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Through towering glass windows, the city glittered beneath the night sky. Streams of headlights flowed like rivers of light between skyscrapers. It was the kind of view that usually impressed people. Tonight, neither of them looked at it. Ethan waited until they were seated before speaking again. When I was 17, my father became stranded during a winter storm outside Philadelphia. Naomi listened carefully. Ethan's voice remained calm, but there was something fragile beneath the control. Something personal. The roads were nearly impossible to travel. Communication systems failed. Temperatures dropped below freezing. He paused briefly. Most people kept driving. Naomi said nothing. One woman did not. Ethan looked directly at her. She stayed. The simplicity of the statement carried surprising weight. Naomi could almost picture it. A lonely highway. Snow falling. A stranger refusing to leave another stranger behind. Ethan continued. My father spent years trying to find her. Every year. Every single year. Naomi blinked. Years. Years. Ethan looked down at the bracelet again. He believed he owed her more than a thank you. Something stirred inside Naomi. A memory. Not her memory. Her grandmother's. Suddenly, she remembered sitting at a kitchen table when she was perhaps 10 years old. Her grandmother stirring tea, while snow tapped against the apartment window. Margaret Carter had smiled quietly and said something Naomi barely understood at the time. Sometimes the greatest kindness happens when nobody is watching. At the time, it sounded like one of many life lessons. Tonight, the words returned with startling clarity. Naomi leaned forward slightly. My grandmother always talked about helping people. Ethan listened carefully. Did she ever mention Pennsylvania? Naomi searched her memory. There were flashes, fragments. A photograph she once found inside an old box. A newspaper clipping. A winter storm. Nothing complete. Nothing certain. Maybe, she admitted. But she never told stories to impress anyone. Most of the time, she changed the subject. Ethan smiled sadly. That sounds exactly like the woman my father described. The ballroom around them slowly returned to life. Conversations restarted. Glasses clinked. Music drifted through the air once more. Yet an invisible circle still seemed to surround their table. People continued watching, waiting, hoping for answers. Naomi noticed several executives looking in her direction with entirely different expressions now. Earlier they saw a server carrying drinks. Now they saw someone connected to a mystery that had captured the attention of Ethan Whitmore himself. It was remarkable how quickly perception could change. Yet Naomi remained focused on only one thing. Her grandmother. The woman who spent decades working, giving, helping, and expecting nothing in return. The woman who never once mentioned changing the course of another family's future. Ethan drew a slow breath. Then he asked the question that neither of them seemed fully prepared to hear answered. Naomi, do you know if your grandmother kept any journals, letters, or old boxes from that period of her life? Naomi hesitated. Then her eyes widened. Because suddenly she remembered something sitting untouched in her apartment closet. A weathered cedar box she had inherited 6 months earlier after her grandmother passed away. A box she had never opened. The memory hit Naomi so suddenly that she forgot about the ballroom, the donors, the cameras, and the city. Lights beyond the glass. She could see the cedar box as clearly as if it were sitting in front of her. Dark wood. Brass hinges worn smooth with age. A tiny scratch near one corner where her grandmother once dropped it while moving apartments. The box had spent years tucked away on the highest shelf of a bedroom closet. After Margaret Carter passed away 6 months earlier, Naomi inherited it along with a few books, family photographs, and the silver bracelet she now wore every day. She had never opened the box. Not because she did not care. Life simply kept getting in the way. Long workdays became longer weeks. Bills arrived. Deadlines piled up. Grief settled quietly into the corners of her life. The box remained untouched. Waiting. I have something, Naomi said quietly. Ethan leaned forward. Something from your grandmother? She nodded slowly. Maybe. I am not sure. There is an old cedar box at my apartment. For the first time that evening, genuine hope appeared in Ethan's eyes. Not business optimism. Not investor confidence. Something much more personal. Around them, the gala continued unfolding beneath golden light and polished elegance. Yet Naomi sensed the evening had become about something entirely different. The auction items, the speeches, the fundraising goals, all of it suddenly felt smaller than the story quietly emerging between them. Ethan rested his hands on the table. My father spent nearly 20 years searching for answers. His voice softened. After he recovered, he hired private investigators. He contacted local newspapers. He reached out to emergency responders who had worked that storm. Naomi listened carefully, and nobody found her. Ethan shook his head. Nobody. The answer carried a sadness that decades had never fully erased. Every Christmas, he would tell the story again. Every year. Ethan looked toward the skyline beyond the windows. He used to say there were two kinds of wealth. The kind you keep and the kind you give away. Naomi smiled faintly. That sounds like something my grandmother would say. Ethan laughed softly. The sound surprised both of them. It seemed strange and unfamiliar coming from a man known for seriousness and discipline. Yet it felt genuine. Nearby, several guests noticed. Whispers spread once again. The sight alone was unusual enough. Ethan Whitmore laughing with a waitress. Some donors could not stop staring. Others looked confused. A few appeared uncomfortable. Naomi noticed the reactions, but chose to ignore them. She had spent years understanding how quickly people assign value based on appearances. Earlier, she had been invisible. Now she was suddenly interesting. Yet she remained exactly the same person. The realization was impossible to miss. Ethan seemed to notice it too. He glanced toward the room before looking back at Naomi. Funny, is it not? What? She asked. How quickly people decide who matters. Naomi followed his gaze. Several guests immediately looked away when they realized they had been caught watching. She smiled knowingly. I learned that lesson a long time ago. Ethan nodded. I think I am still learning it. The admission surprised her. Powerful people rarely admitted unfinished lessons. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Naomi remembered something else. Another fragment from years ago. There was a photograph. Ethan's attention sharpened instantly. A photograph? Naomi nodded. I found it when I was younger. She searched her memory carefully. A man standing beside an old truck. Snow everywhere. My grandmother kept it inside a book. Ethan sat completely still. Do you still have it? Maybe. If it was in the cedar box. The possibility settled between them like a spark waiting to become fire. For 22 years, one family had searched for answers. For 22 years, another family carried pieces of those answers without realizing their significance. The coincidence felt almost impossible. Yet there it was. Real. Waiting. Ethan glanced at his watch before looking back at Naomi. Would you be willing to check? Naomi hesitated. The question seemed simple. Yet she understood it was not. Opening that box meant opening part of her grandmother's life she had never explored. It meant stepping into memories she had postponed confronting. It meant accepting that tonight had changed something. Perhaps many things. She looked down at the bracelet one more time. Then she remembered her grandmother's voice. Character is what remains when everything else is taken away. Slowly, Naomi raised her eyes. Yes, she said. I will check. Ethan released a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. Neither of them noticed that across the ballroom, several guests were already wondering how a woman serving drinks had somehow become the most important person at the gala. The remainder of the evening passed in a strange blur. The gala continued exactly as planned on the surface. Speeches were delivered. Donations were announced. Applause rose and faded beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Yet for Naomi, everything felt different now. Every time she moved through the ballroom carrying drinks or collecting empty glasses, she could feel eyes following her. Earlier, those same guests barely noticed her existence. Now conversations paused when she walked by. Smiles appeared where indifference once lived. Some guests even addressed her by name after reading it from her badge. It was remarkable how quickly people adjusted their perception when someone powerful showed interest. Naomi understood the lesson immediately. Respect offered because of proximity to power was not the same as genuine respect. Her grandmother had taught her that too. Near the end of the evening, Ethan remained occupied with donors and board members, yet he occasionally glanced across the room as if making sure Naomi was still there. The look was never intrusive. It carried the quiet focus of someone afraid a long-awaited answer might disappear again. Shortly after 10 o'clock, the final presentation concluded. Guests began filtering toward private elevators and waiting cars outside. Manhattan glittered beyond the ballroom windows like a sea of stars trapped beneath glass. Naomi finished her last assignment, returned her serving tray, and signed out at the staff station. Most nights, she left unnoticed. Tonight was different. Several employees stopped her before she reached the service exit. "What was that all about?" one server asked. "How do you know Ethan Whitmore?" another added. Naomi smiled politely. "I honestly do not know yet." The answer was true. In many ways, she knew less now than she had earlier. Questions had replaced certainty. Outside, cool autumn air greeted her as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Yellow taxi lights reflected across damp pavement. The city hummed with its usual restless energy. Yet Naomi's thoughts remained fixed on one thing: the cedar box. 40 minutes later, she unlocked the door to her apartment. The familiar scent of old books and lavender greeted her. The small space felt peaceful after the noise of the gala. She slipped off her shoes, set down her bag, and stood motionless in the living room. The apartment suddenly seemed filled with memories. A framed photograph of her grandmother sat on a nearby shelf. Margaret Carter smiled from behind the glass exactly as she always had. Warm, steady, uncomplicated. Naomi found herself staring at the picture. "What did you never tell me?" she whispered. The silence offered no answer. Slowly she crossed the room and opened the closet door. Boxes lined the upper shelves. Winter coats hung neatly along one side. Then she saw it. The cedar box rested exactly where she remembered. Dust covered the lid. The brass hinges reflected a faint glow from the hallway light. For 6 months it had remained untouched. Waiting. Naomi carefully lifted it down and carried it to the kitchen table. Her heart beat faster than she expected. The box was not large, barely 18 inches wide. Yet somehow it felt heavy. Not because of its weight, because of what it might contain. She sat down and rested her hands on the lid. Memories flooded back. Her grandmother teaching her how to ride a bicycle, helping with homework, working extra shifts to keep food on the table, laughing during power outages, and treating inconveniences like adventures. For years, Naomi believed she knew everything important about the woman who raised her. Tonight, she was no longer certain. The apartment remained perfectly quiet. Outside, distant traffic moved through the city below. Inside, only the ticking of a wall clock broke the silence. Naomi took a slow breath, then another. Finally, she lifted the latch. The old metal clasp clicked open with a sound so small it should have meant nothing. Yet in that moment it felt louder than anything she had heard all night. Because whatever waited inside that box had the power to connect 2 families, solve a mystery buried for more than 2 decades, and reveal a side of Margaret Carter that even her own granddaughter had never known. The lid opened slowly. A faint scent of cedar and old paper drifted into the room. Naomi stared inside, suddenly afraid to touch anything. It felt less like opening a box and more like opening a conversation interrupted years ago. The contents were arranged with surprising care. Several bundles of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Old photographs stacked neatly in one corner. A small leather journal. Newspaper clippings yellowed by time. And beneath everything else, a sealed envelope with her name written in her grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. Naomi froze. Her throat tightened. For a moment, she simply stared at the envelope. Margaret Carter had never been a dramatic person. She believed important things should be said directly. Yet here was a letter she had never mentioned. Naomi carefully picked it up. The paper felt fragile beneath her fingers. Slowly she opened it. The handwriting was instantly familiar. "Dear Naomi, if you are reading this, then there is something you deserve to know." Naomi swallowed hard and continued. "Your grandmother was not perfect. I made mistakes. I kept secrets. Not because I was ashamed, but because some stories belong to the people they help, not the people who tell them. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. Outside, a siren echoed somewhere far below the apartment window before fading into the distance. The city continued moving while her world stood still. She kept reading. More than 20 years ago, during a terrible winter storm in Pennsylvania, I met a man stranded on the side of a highway. He was frightened and alone. Anyone would have helped him. I simply happened to be there first. Naomi stopped breathing for a second. Naomi barely slept. The letter remained on her kitchen table long after midnight, illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp. Every few minutes, she found herself reading the same lines again, as if the words might somehow change. They never did. The truth remained exactly where her grandmother had left it. By sunrise, the city outside her apartment had begun another restless day. Traffic filled the streets. Coffee shops opened their doors. Office towers welcomed thousands of workers. Yet Naomi felt as though she had stepped into a different world entirely. Shortly after 8 o'clock, her phone vibrated. The message was simple. Good morning. I hope I am not intruding. Ethan Whitmore. Naomi stared at the screen for several seconds before replying. You are not intruding. I found something. 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, a message arrived. Can we meet today? 1 hour later, Naomi sat inside a quiet conference room overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline. Sunlight reflected from neighboring towers, filling the room with silver light. Ethan arrived carrying no assistants, no lawyers, no executives. Just himself. The moment he entered, Naomi understood something important. He was nervous. Not the nervousness of a businessman preparing for a negotiation. Something far more personal. Ethan took a seat across from her. Neither spoke immediately. The cedar box rested between them on the polished conference table. For a moment, both simply looked at it. A small wooden box holding answers that had waited more than 2 decades to be discovered. Naomi carefully slid the letter toward him. You should read this. Ethan nodded and unfolded the pages. The room grew silent except for the distant hum of the city beyond the glass. As his eyes moved across the handwriting, Naomi watched the controlled confidence she had seen at the gala slowly disappear. Not completely, just enough. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. By the time he reached the final paragraph, he removed his glasses and looked away. His father had been gone for 6 years. Yet somehow this letter had brought him back into the room. Ethan stared through the window for several moments before speaking. This is her. Naomi nodded. I know. Ethan lowered his eyes to the photograph she had placed beside the letter. The image of his father standing beside the truck seemed to affect him even more. He touched the edge of the photograph carefully, almost reverently. He carried this smile his entire life, Ethan said quietly, even when things were difficult. Naomi smiled. My grandmother always said grateful people smile differently. Ethan laughed softly through visible emotion. Then he looked at the sentence written on the back of the photograph. Never underestimate what one act of kindness can become 20 years later. He read it twice, then a third time. The room remained silent. Neither seemed eager to interrupt the moment. Finally, Ethan leaned back in his chair. Do you know what amazes me most? Naomi shook her head. She never told anyone. Ethan nodded. Exactly. He looked down at the letter again. Most people would have turned that story into their identity. She carried it quietly. Naomi thought about all the years her grandmother worked, sacrificed, and helped others without seeking recognition. The realization filled her with pride. Not because Margaret Carter had changed someone's life. Because she never needed anyone to know she had done it. Ethan folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. Then he looked directly at Naomi. My father spent 20 years searching for her because he wanted to thank her. His voice softened. I spent 22 years benefiting from a future she helped protect without even realizing it. Sunlight flooded the conference room as the morning brightened outside. For the first time since the gala, Naomi understood why Ethan had looked so stunned when he saw the bracelet. It was not the jewelry. It was what the bracelet represented. A forgotten act of kindness. A mystery finally solved. And a woman whose quiet character had reached across decades to connect 2 lives that should never have crossed paths. 3 weeks later, the Grand Crescent Ballroom looked almost exactly the same. The same crystal chandeliers poured gold across the room. The same skyline glittered beyond the towering windows. The same elite circles gathered beneath the soft music of a live quartet. Yet something had changed. This time, Naomi Carter was not carrying a tray. She stood near the front of the room beside Ethan Whitmore as hundreds of guests filled the ballroom. Some recognized her immediately. Others remembered the whispers from the previous gala. Nearly everyone wondered why she was standing on stage. Ethan waited until the room settled into silence. Then he stepped to the podium. The confidence everyone expected was still there. The authority was still there. But tonight there was something else. Gratitude. Real gratitude. A few weeks ago, he began, I attended an event in this room and noticed a silver bracelet. A few guests smiled, recognizing the story already circulating through New York's business circles. Ethan continued, At the time, I believed I was looking at a piece of jewelry. What I was actually looking at was a bridge between two families, two generations, and a lesson my father spent his life trying to teach me. The room listened carefully. No phones. No side conversations. No distractions. Ethan rarely spoke about personal matters. When he did, people paid attention. He told them about the winter storm, about the stranger who stayed when she could have walked away, about the decades-long search for answers, and finally, about Margaret Carter, a woman most people in the room had never heard of, a woman who never appeared on magazine covers, never owned a company, never managed an investment fund, yet somehow her influence had reached every corner of Ethan's life. The greatest investment my father ever benefited from was not financial, Ethan said. It was human. Silence filled the ballroom. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. The kind that appears when people recognize something true. Ethan then stepped aside and looked toward Naomi. The crowd followed his gaze. Naomi felt her heart race as she approached the podium. Public attention had never been comfortable for her. Yet she remembered her grandmother's words. Stand tall. Especially then. She looked across the room and saw faces that once would have overlooked her completely. Tonight they were listening, not because of her uniform, not because of her connection to a billionaire, because of the story, because of what it represented. Naomi smiled softly. My grandmother believed kindness should travel farther than recognition. The room remained still. She never expected applause. She never expected rewards. She simply believed helping people was part of being human. Several guests lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Naomi continued. The amazing thing is that she never knew what happened afterward. She never saw the future she helped create. Ethan looked down briefly. Naomi noticed. Sometimes we spend so much time asking whether our actions matter that we forget the answer may not arrive during our lifetime. The words settled over the room. Gentle. Simple. Powerful. A few moments later, Ethan revealed the final surprise. In honor of Margaret Carter's legacy, Whitmore Capital was establishing a nationwide scholarship fund supporting students pursuing careers in education, community service, and social work. The fund would carry her name. Applause erupted across the ballroom. Not the polite applause often heard at charity events. Something warmer. Something genuine. Naomi stood quietly as the room rose to its feet. For a moment she imagined her grandmother seeing all of this. She would probably laugh. Then she would remind everyone to stop making such a fuss. Because that was who she was. As the applause continued, Ethan stepped closer and spoke quietly enough that only Naomi could hear. My father wanted to thank her. Naomi smiled. I think she would tell him he already did. Ethan nodded. Across the ballroom, beneath rivers of golden light and beyond the reach of money, status, or titles, one truth stood taller than everything else. The richest person in the room was never the billionaire. It was the woman who spent her life giving away what mattered most and never asked for anything in return.